Well, welcome back. We're going to take a look further at some of these first settlers who were also explorers. In fact, these men, when they came over here, men and women and children, were coming into a land that there wasn't much written information available for. And so they had to record it. They had to write down early records and journals. They had to make the first maps as well as creating an actual civilization. But because they had a worldview that writing things down is important so you can pass it on, so you can also have accountability because you know what has been said and decided, all of those things were done by them quite effectively. But part of the trailblazers, or some of the trailblazers who came over here at the same time and shortly after, were the missionaries. In fact, these were circuit rider pastors. These were men who were used to traveling something like 500 miles in a given circuit, visiting settlement after settlement, giving a few sermons, baptizing lots of babies, offering communion, things like that. Men such as Samuel Doak, or Gideon Blackburn, or Charles Cummings. These were men who used their mounts as pulpits. They often used the heavens as a sounding board, as George Whitefield said. And they would often preach with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. Not to make people behave, although that might not be a bad idea, but because there always was a threat of attack. In fact, the settlers were kind of like the men in, say, Nehemiah's day, when they built the wall and they had to have their spade in one hand and their sword in the other, because there was always a threat that, say, the natives, if they weren't in agreement with this new settlement, or if they had some other issue with the settlers, would attack, and natives attack by surprise, which is how most attacks are done anyway. Well, even so, these circuit riders were incredible. In fact, the Methodist circuit riders, for example, were known for their endurance and perseverance. In fact, when it would storm really badly in these days, and it was so badly raining or so badly thundering and lightning that it was a custom to say that there's nothing outside today except for crows and Methodists, because the Methodists didn't give up. And the other circuit riders had a similar endurance. In fact, the Moravian pastors also did these very same things. What's incredible is when these men came to settlements, they not only performed basic services, but they also led revivals. Many of the people in these towns, we find out, were quite ignorant of religious matters. They had some idea of the gospel, but often they had no real concept of how it actually worked or even who the basic characters of it were. Further, what's incredible about these men is they often helped establish the infrastructure over here in the lands beyond the mountains. For example, they established churches. They established schools, which became the first universities throughout states such as Ohio or Kentucky or Tennessee or Alabama. Without their founding work, it would be hard to imagine that states in this region of the country ever would have become states in the first place. But these missionaries did not just focus upon the settlers, they also focused on the natives, particularly the Cherokee, which is one of the greatest nations of natives at the time. In fact, the Cherokee had largely resisted many of the missionaries, but it wasn't necessarily because of the Cherokee always. Part of it was because the missionaries themselves. In fact, many of the missionaries refused to try and teach the gospel to the Cherokee because they said the Cherokee language had no term for things like redemption or atonement, and it didn't. And so they just argued, well, you can't even explain the gospel message to them because their language doesn't even understand it. And part of the reason they thought this way was because they refused to even learn the Cherokee language in the first place. But still, people such as the Moravian Christians were able to successfully minister to the Cherokee, and eventually such good men as Daniel Buttrick or Evan Jones both came to the Cherokee Nation, and they lived amongst the Cherokees, and they learned their language. They recognized that, sure, the Cherokee do not have a word for redemption or atonement, but what the Cherokee do have is they have a worldview present in their language. In fact, they argued that the Cherokee really didn't think like the Greeks, which is how the New Testament is written and organized. But the Cherokee really thought like the Hebrews. They tended to associate images with words and ideas. So when they looked at a mountain, they thought, oh, a mountain, of course, is a high place, but it's also a meeting place with God or the gods, which if you look throughout the scriptures, God often meets men on mountains. And so the Cherokee, having this worldview, were able to be reached through these ideas. At the same time that Buttrick and Jones were with the Cherokee, a famous Cherokee by the name of Sequoyah developed a written alphabet for the Cherokee language. Once this was in place, once the Cherokee had this brilliant innovation of a way to record what they spoke and what they said, Jones was able to take that knowledge and able to translate the Bible into the Cherokee language. It was an incredible tool for evangelizing the Cherokee. Furthermore, at the same time that all of this evangelism is going on and all of this explosion of faith is going on, you have an explosion in the actual Cherokee state itself. By 1792, they had developed an established legal council, which decided all great matters of law for the Cherokee. By 1808, showing the influence of the Moravians, they had written their law down. They essentially had a constitution. And by 1817, they had a full-fledged republic with a government of 3 branches, checks and balances, extremely similar to our own. In fact, if you went to the Cherokee Nation at this time, you would see courts, you would see roads, you would see police stations, you would see schools, you would see churches, and you would see a free press. They had newspapers, and the people of the Cherokee had a quite established nation. It was an incredible development. Well, we'll talk about their story more when we talk about how the Cherokee's nation really came to an end or came to a huge interruption, but that's another tale. As this is all going on, one thing that we mentioned in a previous lesson when we talked about Jefferson was how Jefferson made that remarkable purchase of Louisiana from the French. Now that occurred in the year 1803, so it occurs while the Cherokee are still developing. And when that occurred, it was curious how it happened. See, Jefferson authorized some of his ambassadors to go to France and to make negotiations with the government of France, which was ruled by Napoleon at the time. And the deal was they could spend $10 million to buy the city of New Orleans with its great port and with its access to the Mississippi River. Napoleon, who had no interest in New France, he saw it as this forgotten piece of land, told the ambassadors through his agents that he was willing to sell not just New Orleans, but all of New France, what was essentially called Louisiana, for just $5 million more. And so for $50 million, we bought the entire territory. It doubled our size, and it included the entire states of Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, as well as significant sections of the states of Minnesota, both of the Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and Texas. All of this was an incredible boom to our opportunities, and it was all accomplished for only 3 cents per acre. But what's remarkable about it, and one thing that you need to keep in mind, is it was unprecedented, meaning it hadn't happened before, but it also shows you a president purchasing land, or authorizing people to purchase land for the government, even though he had no constitutional right to do so. This, of course, was always one of the issues in American politics, because the question always was, what rights or powers does the Constitution actually grant, and what does it not? That was one of the great debates that went into the war between the states, for example, and still continues to this day with every bit of legislation that we argue before the Supreme Court. Even so, we're not going to dwell on that point at this juncture. What we want to take a look at is what happened next. And what happened next was Thomas Jefferson organized one of the greatest exploratory expeditions that has ever been done in the history of the world. And that, of course, was the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis, who was a captain and who was a secretary of Thomas Jefferson, along with his partner, William Clark, another captain and also a relative of George Rogers Clark, who conquered much of the Northwest, were chosen to lead this, and Jefferson gave them a primary charge. The primary charge they had was to take the rivers and to try and find a direct river access all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But he also charged them to make negotiations with the natives, to make peace with them, and to begin to purchase their lands. This is something that Lewis and Clark were actually able to quite successfully begin. But then finally, Jefferson charged them, and one of the things the Lewis and Clark expedition did was simply to know what's out there, to document it, to bring back as many examples of the land, of the animals, of the plants, of anything that they could record, and actually show the world what was out there beyond, what the incredible opportunities we had were. And so, with their core of discovery, some 30-plus men in this one outfit on 2 different boats, in the year 1804, they set off up the Missouri River and began passing settlements that they really didn't even know existed at the time. What's curious about these settlements is they were almost all founded by relatives of Daniel Boone, still pushing their way west. Along the way, they did meet most of those natives. In fact, they had mostly friendly experiences with natives, except for the Sioux. The Sioux and Lewis and Clark tended to be a little wary of each other. But it was through the help of a such native as Sacagawea, the wife of a French fur trapper, that actually got them to the Pacific Ocean by December of 1805. But along the way, they kept an amazing detailed journal. They also brought back information and examples from 178 different plants and 122 different animals. They even brought back a live prairie dog for Jefferson to take home to Monticello. They brought back countless gifts from natives. They brought back all kinds of information to make an accurate map of the lands that they had seen. But they also brought back tales of incredible beauty, of incredible adventure, tales in which they could describe buffalo or bison. In fact, they said that the bison were so numerous that it took a column of bison, which was a mile wide, it took them an hour to cross the river. In other words, there were untold millions of bison in this one column. They also told tales of grizzly bears, who were quite aggressive, who would chase them on horse, or even one example of a grizzly bear getting in the river and swimming after their canoe. So they had several narrow escapes. But they even brought back tales where they had encountered Scotch-Irish hunters already in the Rockies. These were the men who founded the West as we know it. These were really the beginning days of the Wild West, only it wasn't that wild. Most of these men were actually agrarians looking for incredible opportunities, and they typically were on good terms with the local natives. But still, what the Lewis and Clark expedition did was it showed the incredible beauty and the incredible gift that America had been given. And men like Jefferson actually had a wise idea of how that should be used. Often it was, and often it was not. But that, of course, is the divide between agrarianism and mercantilism, and the story for the rest of American history.